Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, it's very difficult to be one of the last speakers for a conference because everybody seemed to be tired, exhausted, and we just lost one of the panelists, which means myself and my co-panelists have a work cut out for us to keep you engaged. But first of all, thanks again to Dr. Gary for inviting me, and it was an honor to receive the award this morning. So what I wanted to do is, before I get into the presentation, I'll just say a few words about the Edison Electric Institute, who we are and what we do. And the title of this panel is Energy Storage and the Future of Electric Vehicles, looking at new trends and technologies. You've heard already this morning and this afternoon about what's going on in India and elsewhere in the world with regards to investments. A lot of discussions about the different policy strategies being deployed by different banks. And what has been missing from this conversation, at least thus far, which is what I'm going to focus on, is to some extent, what is the role of the utilities? And I'll get back to why I think it's important. So who we are, Edison Electric Institute, we are the association that represents in the U.S. all investor-owned utilities, and I re-emphasize investor-owned utilities in the U.S. And we also have over 70-plus members who are international utilities from around the world with operations in about 90 countries. And I run the international program. We're based in Washington, D.C., but like I said, we have members that are all across the world, including India. And the international program, basically, what we do is we do a lot of work with the executives of utilities around the world, looking at peer-to-peer networking. We also are involving a lot of working groups internationally. We're also very much involved in creating best practices and looking at best practices when it comes to different evolving issues around the world. And so part of what we do is we spend a lot of time looking at strategic issues that are affecting electric utilities around the world, everything from policy to technology, looking at business models. And then we also spend a lot of time looking at how technologies can be deployed and how the utilities, whether at the executive level, can share the best practices in terms of what's being done. So that's what we're doing in a nutshell. Now, I wanted to start my remarks by talking about what I call the pathways to scaling up energy storage in electric vehicles. A lot of the discussions about energy storage seem to sometimes suggest that there is only one solution to energy storage in terms of how it's going to be deployed. There are those who believe that energy storage will be used mainly by end-use customers behind the meter. But when you look at what's happening around the world in terms of scaling up energy storage, and eventually we will see the same thing when it comes to scaling up electric vehicles, there's a very important role that the utilities play, whether it's the DISCOs, or whether it's the TRANSCOs, or in many cases even the role of large IPPs. And that is very important because how you scale up these technologies will not only affect the cost, but it will also affect the bankability of projects because you will have more and more players who have deployed these technologies, and that will make the investment decisions even easier for bankers and others. You heard from the European Investment Bank, you heard from the banks in India. So scaling up is very important, but there's no one-size-fits-all approach. The approach that is going to be taken in India will not be exactly the same approach that will be taken in the U.S., or will not be the same approach that you will take in Africa or in Latin America. So because there are no one-size-fits-all for how you scale up these technologies, it means that when you start looking at best practices, you should always put it in the right context. I hear oftentimes when people say, and I think the previous speaker talked about, what can India learn from the U.S. or what can the U.S. learn from India? It's very important when you adapt different solutions that you then try to put it in the local context. And so that's what this slide talks about, many different ways to achieving the same goal of scaling up of energy storage or electric vehicles. So one of the things EEI did earlier, it started actually last year, it finished this year, was to look at energy storage, the potential for energy storage from a utility perspective, but also from a customer perspective. And there are a couple of things that came out that is summarized in a report that you can find on the internet and download that talks about, first, the technologies, because the different energy storage technologies all have different intrinsic capabilities. The role of the utilities, and I'll come back to that. The benefits of storage, as the previous speaker talked about the role of storage in organized markets, but then also cost and value. And we'll get back to that because it's very important that as we look at energy storage, we really ask ourselves the question, when is it going to be truly cost competitive and when is it going to be really a tool that can be used to eliminate some of the energy poverty challenges we have around the world? So storage can be used in many different places. And I would argue to some extent the same thing will apply to electric vehicles, and I'll get back to telling you why I think that is the case. So everything from the generation side, where you can have large-scale storage, and we have a lot of them today. We have pump storage. We have large compressed air energy storage in parts of Europe. And then you can use it on the transmission grid for things like ancillary services that will be required for frequency regulation. You can use behind the meter on the customer side. What is important, irrespective of where you use energy storage, the system as a whole, the grid as a whole, has to still function. And one of the interesting conversations that you need to look at is there are two aspects to energy storage. One is off-grid energy storage, which is going to be very essential addressing some of the challenges in rural communities around the world. But I think in terms of scaling up energy storage, what is going to happen has to happen at the grid level. Because the size of the projects, most banks do not want to invest in one single behind-the-meter energy storage project that is still expensive. So what is going to be very important is how do you scale up and aggregate these resources at the grid level? And so doing that means that the policies and strategies around integrating all of these resources, both energy storage, but also electric vehicles, has to happen at the grid level, and that's what I think we need to really focus on in terms of scaling up. In fact, today in the U.S., it is clear that most of the energy storage that has been deployed are being deployed by the utilities. Again, remember, scaling up is very important to bringing the cost down, and economies of scale is what's going to drive the cost down, and one way to drive the cost down is to make sure you can bring large amounts of energy storage onto the system. To do that, obviously, the role of the utilities, whether it's the DISCOMs or whether it's the large IPPs, it becomes very critical. So already in the U.S., almost 90% of all the energy storage that has been deployed by the utility. So think about what energy storage has meant in terms of the utilities, and think about renewables. In fact, it is the situation in the U.S. and I believe also in India that the vast majority of renewables that have been deployed by the utilities. The same goes for energy storage. The reason is scaling up these types of resources requires huge investments. And oftentimes, a distributed solution does not necessarily create the right appetite for investors. And so looking at large-scale energy storage, whether it's aggregated or not, has to happen through the grid, and that's where the utilities have a very important role to play. Across the U.S., as you can see in this chart, there are a lot of energy storage projects that are popping up all over the country. Again, most of those projects are at the utility scale level, and a few of them, as you can see, at a microgrid level. But for the vast majority of them, it's at the utility level. Again, it's because of the issue of scaling up, and scaling up, again, ties back to this issue of cost. Now, because energy storage can be both generation as well as load, the interesting challenge we're facing as an industry is how do you calculate the cost, but also the value of energy storage? Because if you buy a device that can provide value both as a generation source, but also as a load in terms of reducing sort of a peak demand, then the question is how do you calculate the accumulated value of that resource on the system? And that's where it's becoming more and more interesting, as this notion of the value stack, where you add different sources of value that an energy storage provides to the system. And to look at the total aggregated value of it, it has to look at all those different value streams that are critical. The same thing applies to the costs, right? And you can't just look at the cost of energy storage by looking at one single dimension. You have to look at it as a multifaceted thing and look at, in fact, the total cost of the life cycle of an energy storage, whether it's a battery device or something similar. So I think more and more as we talk about scaling up of energy storage and even electric vehicles, the issue of calculating the value through different value streams is going to be very, very important. So some of the barriers that we see that could slow down this adoption, that could slow down this scaling up of energy storage and eventually EV. One is cost, but obviously cost is going down, but it's still very high in terms of mass deployment. Technical performance is improving. There are some discussions, and I'm sure the next speaker will talk about with regards to inverter technology and how all of that is improving. But I think some of the real hurdles we've seen around the world, not just in the U.S., but around the world, are more from a policy or regulatory standpoint. One is, what is energy storage? The classification, is it a generation source or is it a load? In Europe, for example, one of the recent policy documents aimed to limit the participation in ownership of energy storage by the utilities, because there are those who say, well, if the utilities own energy storage, it gives them market power. Well, in the U.S., in Massachusetts, and in a number of other states, the local government or the regulators have realized that, in fact, if you redefine what is energy storage, there is no reason why utilities cannot own energy storage. Those that have concern about market power and market manipulation, there are ways around this. One way to look at it is saying, well, if you're going to say that the utilities cannot own energy storage, why then can the utilities own capacitor banks? Because what is a capacitor bank? It's nothing else but an energy storage. But there's no one that stops the utilities from owning a capacitor bank. So I think the issue around ownership is something you need to pay very close attention to, because I'm sure it's going to come to India, that debate very soon, where people would say, well, the utilities should not own energy storage. Well, I would argue if they shouldn't own energy storage, why then should they own a capacitor bank? Both of them are energy storage mechanisms that we deploy. And the last thing is the operational integration of energy storage. Clearly, if you ask the question, everyone who's buying their own little energy storage device to use at home, it's great, but at some point, these individuals are going to want to sell their excess power back to the grid. Well, who pays for the grid if people want to use the grid only as a means to sell their excess energy that they have stored? So these are some of the barriers that we think have to be addressed as we look at scaling up energy storage, not just in the U.S., but I think also in India and around the world. Let me just talk briefly about electric vehicles. We've seen a huge uptick of electric vehicles around the world. We've heard announcements of the last couple of months. Volvo, for example, by the year 2020 is not going to produce any more combustion engine. Mercedes is going down that route. More and more car manufacturing companies are getting out of the traditional, combustion technology for vehicles. So we're going to see this huge surge in the use of electric vehicles. We already have high penetrations of EV in China. We're seeing an increased use of EVs in the U.S. What does all of that mean for the grid? What does all of that mean in terms of scaling up? When you have all of these resources connecting to the grid, how do we coordinate? So the role of the utility in helping to scale up renewables and scale up EVs and scale up energy storage is going to be one of coordination. Because if you have 500,000 electric vehicles that can charge and discharge randomly onto the grid in New Delhi, for example, how does the utility coordinate this charge-discharge mechanism on the system? This is something we need to start thinking about. Already, we're seeing an interesting dimension of the role of the utilities. in the U.S., most of the utilities, the investor-owned utilities, have made commitments to invest $250 million to basically use electric vehicles in their fleets. Now, think about what I said previously regarding energy storage and ownership. If you say the utilities cannot own energy storage, but they can actually own electric vehicles, and the electric vehicles are the large ones, in essence, they actually do own energy storage. So I always say that energy storage and electric vehicles are almost brothers or sisters if you think about it, because both of them give you the ability to store energy and to use it as you need it. And so utilities are already investing in the use of electric vehicles, which in essence is energy storage being invested in. One of the main challenges with electric vehicles are the charging stations, the charging infrastructure. Who pays for it? Now, in some countries, the governments are making huge investments in putting in charging stations. One case in point is in Canada, in Hydro-Quebec, in the province of Quebec. They have a very interesting policy now where they're deploying charging stations to accelerate the use of EVs in that country. You're seeing the same thing in Norway, that today has one of the highest penetration of EVs. There you have not just the government investing in charging infrastructure, you have also utilities like Fingrid and others coming and investing there. You have Fortum, the big distribution company, that is now heavily investing in charging infrastructure. So once the infrastructure is in place, then we're going to see a surge in the penetration and use of EVs. But the question is, how does the charging infrastructure, whether it's fast charging or slow charging, how does all of that affect the overall system and the grid in general? Before I end, let me just say one thing. Thomas Edison once said, who you are will show in what you do. And I say this because right now, the electric utilities around the world are doing a lot. One of the things the utilities don't do well is we don't always tell a good story about all the things we're doing. And so, you know, I was glad to be invited to speak here. Since EEI represents electric utilities around the world, I think it was a foresight on Dr. Gary's part to invite us to be here from EEI. But the utility industry is doing a lot. There was a lot of discussions this morning about jobs. In the U.S., and I'm sure if you did this analysis around the world, you will have similar numbers. The electric power industry in the U.S. supports 7 million jobs, of which 2 million or more are directly created by the industry. The other jobs come through their third party and other suppliers. So when the conversation was had this morning with regards to jobs, one of the things people don't realize is that the utility sector creates a lot of jobs, and more jobs will be created through this sector because of penetration of renewables, penetration of EV, and penetration of storage. Another interesting thing is with regards to technology and smart meters. In the U.S., utilities have invested in the purchase of over 70 million smart meters. These are numbers that we don't talk about as an industry. And so I think as we go forward, one of the things we need to do better as an industry is to tell the story of the kinds of investments we're making, but also talk about how we're working with our customers, with the consumers and other commercial and industrial customers to make this overall penetration of renewables and other things work effectively. Now, last thing I think it was mentioned during the investor session, and it is trust. I think one of the things that will make energy storage that has made renewables successful, I remember many years ago when I was still in Sweden, we started the conference on offshore wind when I was at the Royal Institute of Technology. At the first event that we organized, there were only 30 people that showed up. In fact, the gentleman who started this event with myself, Thomas Ackerman, people said we're crazy. The reason why, because at the time, utilities didn't really believe in wind forecasting. So there was this lack of trust. Today, fast forward 15 years, utilities have embraced the use of wind forecasting and solar forecasting. I said that to say that we will see a very slow uptake when it comes to renewables, when it comes to energy storage, when it comes to EV in the first couple of years going forward. But as we build more trust between the utilities, between the consumers, between the regulators, I think we'll see this surge of investments coming to this industry. But key is for us to be able to maximize trust, because without trust, we'll not be able to reach what I think we need to reach when it comes to deployment of storage and electric vehicles. Thank you.